What is up, everyone? I am TST's the Mudman, and it's a new year, and we are going to be experimenting with new formats for the What to Play over the weekend series. The normal format that we're all accustomed to, and I'm going to refer to as the general format from now on, that works very well when we have new cards added to the game, when we have big, impactful balance patches, because we focus on god diversity. We try to find a great deck for each god. But when the meta becomes stagnant, those videos become very repetitive very quickly. And since so much time is focused on god diversity, scouring GU decks, trying to find a magic deck that we can pretend is playable over the weekend, I feel like I don't have enough time to discuss why the good decks are good and how to modify those good decks, as the weekend meta changes. And since we're not going to be focusing so much on god diversity, at least for this format of video, it'll give me more time to focus on like budget decks, which I know the community always loves various budget decks. So for example, we have an Aggro War deck that you can make fairly cheap. We have like a $50 Deception deck that is very budget friendly, especially compared to the normal decks that we focus in on this series. And it's not going to be like incredibly one-sided. Like for example, in this video, we have a handful of control light decks to look at, a handful of aggro war lists, a handful of control war lists. We have some various nature lists and aggro deception lists. So there's still like a good amount of different archetypes to go over. But instead of just looking at one deck for each god, we're going to be looking at multiple decks for each archetype. Comparing and contrasting different control light lists. The hope is that like you, the viewer, will be better equipped to modify your deck like as the weekend meta changes. So by comparing and contrasting multiple lists, you'll be able to see which cards you can remove from the deck, which cards you can't remove from the deck, what cards are good if the meta becomes more control-oriented, which ones are good if it becomes more aggro-oriented, so on and so forth. And if we do these like deep dive videos where we go into like how each deck works and like what's good, if the meta continues to be stagnant, we can focus entirely on budget decks, and I can just point the quote-unquote whales to this deep dive style video, so they can look at all their very expensive decks, and we can focus on budget decks. And just the hope is we can make this video series more appealing. We can help more players and just give all the viewers just a better understanding of how the decks work to make everybody better as a whole. That being said, we're always going to start the videos the same way we always do. We'll discuss the most popular archetype for each god, so you have a good understanding of what you'll be queuing into when you run into, War, Deception, Light, yada yada yada. So with that explanation out of the way, let's jump right into it. So we're on gudex.com looking at the Mythic meta over the past 7 days by god popularity, and as you can see, War is still the most popular god. In fact, it has become even more popular. Almost 30% of all games played over the past week in Mythic meta have been War decks. Aggro War is by far the most popular archetype in the game right now. Like 17% of the meta is standard Aggro War. GU Dex also has the Frenzy Aggro War archetype, which is about 4% of the meta. Those archetypes are the same. So over 20% of the games that you'll be playing over the weekend will probably be some sort of Aggro War deck, because Aggro War is incredibly popular. The second most popular god is Deception. Aggro Deception is back to the top slot in Deception popularity. Aggro Deception was very weak in our last video, and that was mostly because Control Nature was so much more popular, but as you can see, Nature has fallen in popularity, and Nature is very good against any Aggro Deception archetype, but since Nature has dropped off, Aggro Deception has gotten more powerful. Next up, we have Light. Both Zoo Light and Control Light are very, very strong. However, Zoo Light is much, much more common than Control Light. Then we have Nature. Nature decks are primarily control-oriented or like heavy mid-range oriented nowadays. Nature's not the most popular, but if you run into them, they're probably going to do a lot of healing, have a lot of value, and some decent creatures floating around. And then we jump into Magic. Magic and Death are by far the least popular gods. Magic has lots of potential archetypes. They can be control, tempo, combo, but control magic is by far the most common of the control, or of the magic archetypes rather. And then Death, the least popular god, can either be Anubians or zombies. Neither are particularly good in the meta right now, but like I say every week, if you see your Death opponent picks the Soulburn god power, it means they're zombies. If they pick the Blood Ritual god power, then they're probably Anubians. So now that we've gone over the most popular archetypes for each god, let's look at a couple of different Control Light lists, because Control Light is definitely the strongest archetype in the meta right now. And yeah, let's get into it. Alright, so let's dive into Control Light. I've got 3 different Control Light lists to look over. The first one here is made by Lexitan. This was the best performing Control Light list of last week. So let's go over Control Light's general strategy. They usually rely pretty heavily on order in order to stall out the game and get to the late game. We have lots of great order cards in here. We have Censor, which turns 2 creatures off. Divine Judgment doesn't give a creature order, but it does just remove an ordered creature from the game entirely. It's very strong. It gets rid of afterlives. It's good, against Martyrs of White Plains. You understand. 1 mana, get rid of something entirely is pretty strong. We have the Inquisitor Informant, also capable of ordering stuff. We've got Cern for some order. We even have a single copy of Archpriest, which capitalizes on all the order on the board and gives a little bit of order himself. And then we have probably the most important order card in the meta right now in Lips Are Sealed. In the last episode, we talked about Lips Are Sealed and why it's so good in the meta, and that's mostly because of Aggro War. Like I said in the beginning, Aggro War is by far the most popular archetype in the game right now, and most or all of Aggro War's creatures have more than 3 strength, or 3 or more strength, meaning they're all susceptible to Lips Are Sealed. And Lips Are Sealed turns off your opponent's board for 2 turns. So if you have 2 Lips Are Sealeds in your hand, or Lips Are Sealed plus Radiant Embalmer, and you're playing against Aggro War, which you'll be playing a lot of Aggro War this weekend, you can turn off their entire board. The next turn, you can play your Radiant Embalmer, get your Lips Are Sealed back, play the Lips Are Sealed again the following turn, and just like that, you're ready to pip into your 7 drops. So you can either remove their board entirely with Lysander's Mercy, you can pip into Demogorgon and just stall them again and start healing. Your 7 mana cards will generally win you the game against aggro opponents, barring Therial. Therial's a value creature, obviously. But Lips Are Sealed just makes it very, very easy for you to transition from the mid game to the late game, and you really want to get to the late game. Obviously, you have the strong, cards. You have the aforementioned Mercies and Demos and Therials, but we also have Inescapable Duty as well as Radiant Embalmer. You don't need to use Radiant Embalmer to get the Lips Are Sealed back. You can use Radiant Embalmer to get back more Demos, more Mercies, more Therials, what have you. Also, Radiant Embalmer loves picking up more Censors to just stall your opponent even longer. The deck is very strong. It's capable of stopping a lot of different aggro decks, and then because of the Embalmers and the Duties and the Therials, it's able to outvalue the majority of control decks. But let's talk more about Lips Are Sealed before I forget. So, like we discussed, Lips Are Sealed is outstanding against Aggro War. It pretty much wins that matchup by itself. But how does Lips Are Sealed fare against the other aggro decks in the meta right now? So against Zoolite, which is also quite popular, Lips Are Sealed is quite lackluster, right? Because the majority of Zoolite's creatures have 2 or 1 attack naturally. Obviously, Zoolite is known for buffing their creatures, so once they play Radiant Dawn, their 2 attack creatures are Lips Are Sealedable, but the fact of the matter is, Lips Are Sealed will very rarely be ordering your opponent's entire board, and there will be lots of scenarios where Lips Are Sealed is just not worth playing. It'll be ordering 1 to 0 creatures. So against Zoolite, it's not going to be very good, especially considering any creature that's left standing for Zoolite will get buffed and capitalized upon. So if you order 2 of your opponent's creatures and they have 2 remaining, they'll buff the ones that aren't ordered and they'll hurt you more. Another very popular aggro deck in the meta right now is Hidden Rush Deception or Aggro Deception. Lips Are Sealed is also quite good in that matchup. Most of Aggro Deception's creatures have more than 3 attack, or if they don't naturally, they're planning on buffing them with either an Assassin's Aim or a Dark Knives to get them to more than 3 attack. And since the creatures are inherently hidden, it's very difficult for you to order them normally. So the majority of your order cards, like your Informant, like your Cern, like your Censor, they require you to target creatures, and you can't target hidden creatures, obviously. Whereas Lips Are Sealed doesn't care about hidden. It can, turn off Armor Lurkers. It can stop, whatever 4 mana 4/4 they've played. It can stop a big buffed Pyramid Warden, what have you. And then it does the same thing as it does for the Aggro War matchups, where it just helps you transition into your Lysander's Mercies, into your Demos, and just shut them out of the game entirely. And for those Aggro Deception matchups, you do obviously have Yukos, which is outstanding against Aggro Deception. It gets rid of their Armor Lurkers, gets rid of their Shadow of Lethanons, it makes it so they can't Orpheos distract their creatures as much as they normally would. It's very strong. But so in conclusion for the Lips Are Sealed, It's outstanding against Aggro War, which is the most popular archetype. It's lackluster against Zoo Light, which is also quite popular, and it's fairly strong against Aggro Deception. So, like, if War still continues to be the most popular archetype, then you're probably going to want to keep your 2 Lips Are Sealed. It's very, very strong. And then, like, besides that, if you're playing like a control matchup, we do have like strong value tools. We talked about the inescapable duties and the radiant embalmers, but we also have a copy of Lysander's Spear, which just makes it so any creature that you have can just become a big threatening creature. It also makes it so your smaller creatures can trade into bigger creatures, obviously. And we also have the Parthene Parsinium, the big stage. It fills a similar role that Lysander's Spear does. It's a creature with Protected and Ward, so it's very difficult to remove. You can either heal, your entire board for 3, which, in combination with your Heal God power means you can heal yourself for 5 every turn until it's removed. And you can also buff your weakest creature +3 attack, making something tiny like an Inquisitor Informant capable of trading into a much larger creature. And considering the Parsinium can attack on its own, your aggro opponents will have to put a lot of resources into destroying it, which they won't want to do. As an aggro player, you don't want to be throwing spells and creatures into a card that can't even attack on its own, but you can't just leave it up because it is going to heal you and make creatures very big the entire game. So yeah, like all in all, Control Light is very, very powerful. We're going to refer to this as the baseline deck, so if you're copying deck codes in the description, this one will be Light Deck number 1, the next one will be number 2. I'll be numbering them as they're shown in the video. Maybe in the future we come up with a better way of distinguishing each deck. Maybe we incorporate timestamps, who knows? Maybe one of you at home has a good suggestion, but let's take a look at the next Control Light list. This one was made by M7SN, and as you can see, it's quite similar. Let's take a look at some of the differences. As you can see, this one only has 1 copy of Lips Are Sealed and 2 copies of Lysander's Mercy, whereas the last deck had 2 seals and only 1 mercy. M7SM has probably deduced that this card, although incredibly powerful against Aggro War, is not necessarily great against Zoo Light. It's also very, very weak in the control versus control matchups. So he has omitted 1 copy. However, as you can see, he does have a copy of Enlightenment, which means, if you are uninitiated, Enlightenment makes you discard 2 cards, and then you search your deck for whatever 2 cards you want, put in your hand. So you should be able to get your Lips Are Sealed, relatively consistently through your mulligans or just through drawing Enlightenment. Let's see, some other important changes here is we do have a copy of Thawed Heart. Thawed Heart's a fairly new card from Winter Wonderland. You obliterate your opponent's void entirely, and you heal 1 for each creature removed. So it can potentially be a mass heal effect, if you're playing against something like Zoo Light or like Aggro War. If you're playing against the Nubians, it just beats them hands down. It pretty much beats any Death archetype. Death loves to interact with the board, or with the Void rather. It's also very, very good in the mirror match, so you stop your Control Light opponent from being able to pull creatures from their inescapable duty or from their Radiant Embalmer. Manipulating the Void is very good in the meta right now. Most gods interact with the Void in some way, shape, or form. Let's see, we've also got a copy of Mary Cadmos in here. The last deck had the Archpriest. Mary Cadmos is a very strong card. It's a 3/4 with frontline, so it's defensive inherently, and it has 2 effects. It really only has 1 effect, so it's Roar, pull a creature from the board and put it on to the controller's deck, so it just slows down your opponent. It potentially just eliminates their next draw. It's a very strong, high-tempo card. And besides that, it functions very similarly to the other deck. Oh, well, we didn't talk about the relic removal. Both decks have the Vesper in there. Really good against, all the various Aggro War decks. Great against all the Death decks. Not that you need more help with Death, because you do have the Thawed Heart. But those are the main differences between the first 2 Control Light lists. Both of them are very strong. I guess if, like gun to my head, I think I like this one a little bit more. But now let's take a look at the 3rd Control Light list. Alright, and the final Control Light list to go over is Fake Muse's Control Light list. And this one is radically different than the last 2 we looked at. This one is much more of a mid-range light list. It's sort of like a hybridization between normal Zoo Light and Control Light. As you can see, we have no Lysander's Mercies, no lips or seals, no censors. The only order cards we have in the deck are the Inquisitors and Formans, as well as the Sterns. So Fake Muse here is controlling the board state primarily with creatures, like a normal Zoo Light list would, and then it just transitions into 7 mana cards. We have the Therial for when you're up against those like other control decks and need more value. You have the Demo so you can beat other aggro decks. But this deck is unique in the sense that if you are playing against a control deck, and although aggro is more popular because of Aggro War, there are a lot of control decks floating around. So this is the type of deck where you can be proactive, you can build a strong board, you can pressure your opponent and just, get them to 0 the old-fashioned way. You don't need to rely on like a whole bunch of, various value, and you don't have those dead order cards in the control matchups. So I like that a lot. This deck is also incredibly strong against Zoo Light, and like we discussed in the last 2 control light lists, those are fairly weak to Zoo Light. They're not horrible matchups, but they're tailor-made to beat Aggro War, and this one is very strong against Zoo Light, and that's primarily because Fake Muse has all 4 Lights levies, 2 of the classics and 2 of the extortionists. So like in those tempo-based matchups, having 4 Lights levies is game-breaking. Destroying their creatures, generating creatures, and forcing them to trade into your creatures will pretty much guarantee that you get to 7 mana, and you can win the game off of your demos and stuff like that. Another very interesting inclusion that Fake Muse has in this deck is Selfless Protector. This card came around in the core set refresh, I think, but it's never really seen any play. It functions a lot like an inverted Martyr of White Plains. It's 1 mana 1/3. After a creature dies, summon it from your void and obliterate this creature. So it works the opposite way as Martyr of White Plains. It has some advantages and disadvantages. Since the creature is summoned from your void, it's not going to retain any of its buffs or anything like that. So if you make something big off a Lysander Spear and you get the copy back, it won't have those spear buffs. However, if you pair something like a Selfless Protector with a Highborn Knight, it becomes much stronger than like Highborn Knight in combination with the Martyr of White Plains. Since you'll get, when you use the Martyr, you get the Highborn Knight as it was when it was destroyed. So when the Highborn Knight does get destroyed, it'll probably lost Protected and maybe even Ward, so it might end up just being a 4 mana 3/3 with Protected, which is not very good at all. Whereas in combination with Selfless Protector, you can play Selfless Protector and Highborn Knight on 5. Your opponent destroys the Highborn Knight, and then it just comes back fully fledged Highborn Knight with all of the keywords, and it's very powerful. It's just a good way to like get value and maintain your board presence. This deck doesn't have any big AoE buffs, no Radiant Dawns, no Asteriuses, but it's still capable of making large creatures. We do have the Felid Janissaries, we have the Lysander Spear, we have the Canonized, as well as the Parstinium, all capable of buffing the board. So if you are seeing that the meta is very control-oriented, a deck like this could be very strong considering it's able to apply pressure in the early game and has like a large potential value bit, with your Therials. And you do, of course, have Therial in combination with double Martyr of White Plains. So if you do need a lot more value, you can get as many as 3 Therials with that, and it's very powerful. So if you are seeing that the meta is becoming more control dominant and you want to be playing, control light, modifying your deck to be more like this one could be very successful. Alright, now let's talk about Aggro War. I've got 3 different Aggro War decks to look at. Let's start things off with Eisen's here. This was the best performing Aggro War list of last weekend ranked event. And Aggro War's strategy is very simple. It's a curve deck. You spend all your mana each turn, you play as many creatures as possible, you go face, you trade when you have to. Ideally, you use your Blitz creatures to trade. You got your Tavern Brawlers in here. You've got your Orcish Elites. You have relics, which obviously aren't blitz creatures, but they're also great for trading. It allows you to destroy your opponent's creatures without injuring your own creatures. You have some strong protected creatures like your Adi, as well as your Raid Reveler. Those are hard to remove, and they deal a lot of damage on their own. We've got a couple of Snowball creatures in here. We have a single copy of Thundercaller, which is a 3/3 for 3 mana, and if you're frenzied, you give your strongest Viking, which is usually Thundercaller +1/+1, so every turn just gets bigger and bigger, dealing more and more damage and becoming harder and harder to remove. On the Snowball creature front, we also have 2 copies of Cunning Challenger, which is a 4 mana 4/4 with Tempt Fate, and at the start of your turn, Tempt Fate again. So ideally, when you play this card, you're looking for hidden, because if it's hidden, it's hard to interact with, and it means you'll probably be able to continue Tempting Fate. So if this creature can survive for multiple turns, it could get a whole bunch of keywords and maybe even Afterlife get some imps. It's a relatively strong creature as long as it can stick around for more than one turn. But keep in mind, you're always looking for hidden, ideally when you are playing this creature for the first Tempt Fate option. Commander Pyros is also sort of like a snowball card. The longer it's on the board, the more its effect is going to go off. Another 3-mana 3/3, just like Thundercaller, and after a friendly creature survives damage, give it +1/+1. This makes it so it's very difficult for your opponent to trade into your creatures effectively. If they need to use 2 creatures to destroy your creature, then they'll be buffing your creature a little bit on the first trade and making it harder to remove. You get the picture. Being able to buff a creature +1/+1 over and over again can be quite strong. We also have some strong creature buffs in here. We have 2 copies of Another Round, and seeing as your curve is so low and you're playing creatures aggressively, you should very likely have a creature to play your Another Round on, whether you're pipping into it on turn 3 or playing it naturally on turn 4. These protected creatures you have coming down the turn before are premium targets for Another Round because they're protected, they're very hard to remove, and if you're lucky, you might be able to Another Round it while it still has protected, which just guarantees it gets an outstanding value trade. And then, of course, there is the Frenzy effect, buffing creatures in your hand whenever you deal damage. And the best buff candidate is most likely Slaymaster Valka, a new card from Winter Wonderland. 5-mana 6/5, so good stats on its own. It has Overkill and Roar. If you have fewer than 2 cards in your hand, this gains Blitz. So Blitz and Overkill is incredibly strong. It allows you to potentially clear your opponent's board while doing some extra damage to face, and this is just a very threatening creature. As far as making this deck more budget-friendly, Valka is making that very difficult. Valka on her own is about like $43-ish. So almost half of the base price is dedicated to just the Valka, and Valka has a very unique effect. There's not really an easy comparison card. If you don't have Valka and you still want to play an Aggro War list, it'll still function well. You can throw something like an Orcish Elite in there, second Orcish Elite, of course, something that can also clear the board, to an effect. Nothing will be as good as Valka. Like I said, she has a very unique effect, but it is replaceable and it'll cheapen the deck substantially if you do so. That being said, the next Aggro War list we look at should be much easier to cheapify, as they say. But besides the these creatures over here, in the neutral slot we have Vanguard Axwoman. Very easy to understand. It's good for trading away your opponent's board, so you can keep your important creatures alive longer, so they can keep doing more damage. We have 2 copies of Feral Shapeshifter, which is hidden, so he's hard to interact with, and he obviously pairs very, very nicely with your Another Round. So you can pip into Feral Shapeshifter on 3, it probably doesn't die, and then you can Another Round it to make it into a 7/7 and just start dealing a whole bunch of damage. Leviathan Hunter is a decent creature. Having that little tiny, what do they call it, a hook, is decent for picking off creatures in the early game. And we do, of course, have a Warmonger Smith to make that creature better. But like I said, you're a curve deck. You're trying to aggressively play creatures, so having more 1-drops to fill out your curve is very strong. We almost forgot to talk about the Woodcutter Imp, another new card from Winter Wonderland. It's a 2-mana 3/3 with God Blitz. It does deal damage to your god equal to the amount of damage that it deals, so there's a small downside, but it's incredibly aggressive with your woodcutter imps, with your relics, and with your consistent Slayer god power. It's very easy to chip your opponent down. This card is very powerful. Playing it in the early game may not be the move. Sometimes it's great for getting value trades against Control Light. If you do trade it into something with Protected, say, you won't take any damage, so that's a fun little interaction. But Woodcutter Imp is very, very powerful. Now let's take a look at the next Aggro War list. This one was made by 2 Dots, and this one is very similar. It's also relying on Valka, and as you can see from the curve, this one has an even lower curve. 20 of your 30 cards cost 2 or less mana, and that is premeditated because this deck relies much more heavily on Out of Its Misery, which is a 1-mana spell. You deal 1 damage to a friendly creature. If that creature dies, you pull a creature from your deck and give it +3/+3. And seeing as your curve is so low, you have a very high likelihood of being able to play your Out of Its Misery on turn 1 or 2, and then being able to immediately play the creature that you drew, which will have far higher stats than they should for that mana cost, and that could very easily overwhelm your opponent. We do have the 2 copies of Leviathan Hunter, pairs excellently with your Out of Its Misery. And then there's also Encumber Looter, which is a great Out of Its Misery target, so you can play your Encumber Looter on turn 1. You can destroy with Out of Its Misery, draw a card off of its Afterlife, and then draw an extra big card off of the Out of Its Misery. And in the scenarios where you play Out of Its Misery and draw an Encumbered Looter, it's also quite strong because it'll have 5 attack and be hidden, which makes it hard to interact with, and you can use that to just go face very, very successfully. Besides that, it functions a lot like the last deck. As you can see, we're aggressively playing creatures, trying to empty our hand for the Valka. But like I said just a few minutes ago, I think this deck is easier to make cheaper, despite the fact that its base cost is about $15 more expensive than the list we just discussed. And that is primarily because of Master Tactician. 2 copies of Master Tactician cost about $32. Master Tactician is good, but he's very replaceable. You can add a second copy of Raid Reveler, which is free. Everyone has Raid Revelers when they start the game. If you already have a copy of Adi, Adi is more common than Master Tactician, you can slot the Adi in there. If you don't have Adi and you don't have Master Tactician, they cost pretty much the same price, and you can replace them with any good 2-mana creature that War has access to. It can be Warmonger Smith, it can be Wolf Cult Vanguard. War has no shortage of good 2-mana creatures. So by removing the Master Tactician, you drop $32 off the price. And like I said when we were talking about the last deck, Valka herself costs about $43. So almost the entire deck is Valka plus Master Tactician. So this one is very easy to cheapify. As far as other differences between this deck and the one we just discussed, we have 2 copies of Bloodguard, which is just like a very sticky creature. If you destroy this creature on curve, you also have to deal with the 2 1/1s it creates, which is very difficult to do as early as turn 3. The 1/1s it creates are also prime targets for your Out of Its Misery, which is just very strong. Both the decks that we discussed had 2 copies of White Fur Guard, just a very strong standalone creature. It's a 4-drop, although you almost always play it for 5 mana with the Empower effect. 5 mana, 5/4 with Frontline and Protected is very strong. It's a threatening body on its own, capable of dealing lots of damage. It's a frontline creature, so your aggro opponents have to deal with it. And Protected and a Frontline is very frustrating. It's a very powerful archetype. But between the 2 decks that we just looked at, I personally prefer this one. I think Out of Its Misery is very strong, especially in the aggro versus aggro matchups. If you can get an early Out of Its Misery out, like let's say you get a 1-mana 5/5 Vanguard Axleman, that's like far too many stats for just 1 mana. It can swing the game easily. You have lots of good blitz creatures, the Vanguard Axleman, of course, the Tavern Brawler, outstanding to make bigger. Your protected creatures become very dangerous when they're larger. And, like I said before with the another round, if you pull the Valka off of Out of Its Misery, then all of a sudden Valka has a base 9 attack stat, which is absolutely huge if you can, get the roar effect to go off. It's kind of like you play it and it's already been sudden bloomed. It's incredibly powerful. So yeah, these Aggro War lists, they seem very strong. I think this deck you could make substantially cheaper just by getting rid of those Master Tacticians. But now let's take a look at the final Aggro War list of the video. And this one is made by Alj, I think that's how it's pronounced. And this one is very different than the other 2 lists that we just looked at. As you can see, the curve goes much, much further. We have some 6-mana creatures in here. And this is like an anti-aggro deck. It has far more comeback mechanics in there. We have 2 copies of Soul Survivor, which is a great board clear. It also will buff whatever creature you Soul Survivor for more damage. We have a copy of Kaya, which has a similar effect. It gives you the ability to clear your opponent's board when you fall behind. Other Aggro War decks struggle with that. Usually when an Aggro War deck loses the board, they're just sort of forced to God Power and use relics and maybe a Woodcutter Imp in order to close out the game. Whereas this variation does have comeback mechanics. We have other high tempo destroy cards in here. We have the 2 Blades of White Plains, good for destroying stuff. This deck has 2 copies of Magic Missile Launcher, which is a far more defensive relic than the other decks have been running. We do still have 1 copy of Blade of Sticks, but this one gives you the ability to go face with your relic, and if it gets destroyed, potentially clear your opponent's board as well and get a little bit more healing. One card that may seem out of place, sort of, is End of War. End of War is usually is usually considered a control war card. However, with a curve like this, you should be able to get 5 creatures in your void very, very quickly, which means that this could be a 3-mana spell that potentially destroys 2 of your opponent's creatures. So despite the fact that this isn't generating you a creature, removing 2 of your opponent's creatures for as little as 3 mana is an extremely high tempo play, and mid-range aggro decks like this love high-tempo plays. This list also features more blitz creatures. We have the Vanguard Axewoman as well as the Tavern Brawler from before, but we also have 2 copies of Wolf Cult Vanguard, which is great in the mirror match, and it's extra great against Zoo Light. This deck also features 2 copies of Savage Strike for even more control. It gives it a much, much better matchup against Aggro Deception, which is capable of racing other Aggro War decks. Then there's like some secondary synergies. Savage Strike works, relatively well with your Valkyrie. It's also very strong with your Commander Pyro, so you've got that going for you. In conclusion, all 3 of these aggro war lists are very strong. This one is probably the best against other aggro decks, because of those aforementioned comeback mechanics. But that is it for aggro war. Now let's dive into control war. Alright, now let's jump into war's other archetype. I've got 2 different control war lists to go over. We're going to start things off with Clutch's control war list. Clutch is an excellent control war player, and his deck lists are always very clean, so it should be an excellent baseline war deck to look at. Control War has been one of the best decks for quite some time. Before Winter Wonderland, Control War was by far the best deck. Now it's arguably the 2nd or 3rd best deck. It's still incredibly powerful. As you would imagine, it is a control deck. It controls the board primarily with blitz creatures and relics. We have 2 copies of Wolf Cult Vanguard, excellent for destroying multiple creatures by itself. We have 2 copies of Devouring Blade, which can destroy 2 creatures the turn it's played, the creature you attack, as well as another creature your opponent has. We have Magic Missile Launcher, great for destroying 2 creatures. Afterlife heals you and then deals more damage to your opponent's board, just keeping it clear. Since this is Control War, we obviously have the premium AoE clears. We have 2 copies of Carnage Sweep, as well as 2 copies of Soul Survivor. And on top of the relics we already mentioned, we do have a copy of Leviathan Hunter, which is excellent in combination with either of these AoE clears. In particular, Carnage Sweep. It makes it so on turn 5 you can pip into Leviathan Hunter and then Carnage Sweep and clear your opponent's board. A similar thing can be done with Soul Survivor on turn 6. You can play Leviathan Hunter, pip into Soul Survivor. Obviously, you'd rather be Soul Survivoring a larger creature, something like Demo, but in a pinch, any of your 1-drops doesn't have to be Leviathan Hunter. Gleamweaver also works. You get it. You get the picture. If you can play Soul Survivor, it clears your opponent's board and gives you a big threat. It's very strong. As far as other control tools are concerned, we have the Blade of White Plains, very common card. You don't need much explanation on this. It destroys a creature. It is a creature. It draws you cards. It might draw more cards. It's just amazing. And we also have Encumbered Looter, which doesn't necessarily look like a control card or a removal card at all, but it functions that way. Since it has hidden, it's very difficult for your opponent to remove. They can't use a god power on it. If they use a spell, it's probably like a premium spell, like some sort of AoE to actually get rid of it. So you can play the Encumbered Looter in the early game. It probably sticks around, and then it gets to trade up into whatever creature your opponent has on the board. Maybe you pip away the Protected from like an Oddity or a Raid Reveler, and then Encumbered Looter finishes the job. And then, of course, because of its afterlife, it cycles itself and gets you more stuff in your hand. All great things for control decks. As we go into the late game, we can look at the value stuff. This deck has a very good amount of value. First off, we have 2 Martyrs of White Plains, which means that you can get whatever valuable creature you want, for a second time, which means you can get more copies of Therials. You can get more copies of Avatar of War. We even have a copy of Anagrios in here, which is quite strong considering the meta is primarily aggressive, but there are a lot of control decks floating around, as you may have deduced, considering we've talked about a lot of different control archetypes so far in this video, and we're not even done yet. So if you are playing control versus control matchups, you're probably going to see 9 mana, and having a 9 mana card is very strong. Not only does this have God Blitz and 12 attack, capable of dealing lots of damage, its effect will deal 6 damage to each enemy creature, which will, if it doesn't clear the entire board, it'll clear most of the board, and then just be a huge threatening creature that's over there. And of course, you can pair that with a Martyr of White Plains to get even more copies of Anagrios. We also have Gleamweaver in here. Gleamweaver is quite strong for the control versus control matchups. Most control decks rather run copies of Martyr of White Plains. You can use Gleamweaver to remove the Martyr from the void, like turning off its effect. It's also great against any death archetype. Anubians can sometimes be difficult for these control war decks to deal with. Gleamweaver can remove the important Anubians. Control Light is the best deck in the meta. Control Light does a lot of void manipulation, so Gleamweaver can get rid of whatever their highest impact card in the void is. It's it's a good card. Just like when we were talking about Control Light and Thought Heart, there's a lot of void interactions in the game currently, so Gleam Weaver is just a fine card. And like we discussed earlier, Gleam Weaver is another 1-drop, which is a good card to pair in combination with Soul Survivor for a board clear. So all in all, Control War, it's been very strong. It may not be as good as Control Light, but it's a very powerful control archetype. And now let's take a look at another Control War list. Here we go. This one was made by Nazca, and this deck performed very, very well in the last weekend ranked event, and this deck is extremely greedy. This is the Control War deck you want to run if you know you're going to be playing against other control archetypes. We have all of the same value or high impact cards that the last deck we looked at, Clutch's deck, had. We have the Avatar, we have Anagrios, we have the Demos, we have the Therials. Obviously, there's 2 Martyrs of White Plains. But this deck also has a copy of Jason for even more, late game value, as well as just making your deck bigger for the anti-fatigue matchups. And this deck also runs a copy of Take the Reins, which I don't think we've discussed on this channel yet. Another card from Winter Wonderland. It's a 3 or 7 mana card because of its Empower effect. For 3 mana, you gain control of the strongest enemy creature with less strength than your strongest friendly creature until end of turn. Very lackluster. It's like a more expensive, less consistent Umber Arrow, if you play it for the 3 mana value. But realistically, you're playing it for the 7 mana value the majority of the time. So for 7 mana, you just gain control of any enemy creature until end of turn. So if your opponent has like a big Archpriest on the board, it can be great. If they have their own Anagrios on the board, it can be great. If they have a big Hevnir, if they have a big Apacryas monster, if they have something huge, being able to take it is great. If you're playing against aggro, this is probably pretty weak. Like I said when we first clicked over to this tab, this deck is extremely greedy. It's incredibly greedy. As you can see from like a control standpoint, we only have 1 Wolf Cult Vanguard. We have no Devouring Blades. We do have a copy of Grand Hall, which is quite defensive. It's a frontline creature. It also, if you do have creatures on the board, it gives them Leech, which means you can heal. And we do have a single copy of Encumbered Looter in here, which is a hard creature to interact with, so that's a card that can work in combination with Grand Hall for some more healing. But all in all, this deck removed some of its control tools for more value. So if you've been playing your weekend ranked and you just keep running into control after control, then a Control War list deck like this could be better suited for that. However, by removing your Wolf Cult Vanguards and your Devouring Blades, you're definitely weakening your matchup against like Aggro War, against Zoolite, against Aggro Deception, and those are the most popular archetypes. So if you had to choose between the 2 war decks, I would go with the first one we looked at, Clutch's deck over here, just because it has a better chance overall. And if you are in a situation where you really have to play for value, you just have to be more cognizant, like guarantee your Martyrs of White Plains hit something important like Ethereal. But if you do just really, really want more, more value, more greed, the Jason is going to get you a lot more. The Take the Reins, personally, I don't love, but there are scenarios where it can be like literally game winning. But yeah, that is about it for the Control War list. We have the standard Clutch variant, and then we have the extremely greedy Jason style one. But Control War, like I said in the beginning, it's been really strong. It is really strong. So if you like Control War, either of these decks should work very, very well. Alright, now we have Nature. I've got 2 different Nature decks to show you guys today. We're going to start off with this Control Nature list made by 3 question marks. And this is a pretty normal Control Nature list. It's very similar to the Control Nature list deck we talked about in the last video. And Control Nature deck is mostly known for its immense ability to heal. This deck has a single copy of Winter's Bounty, probably the flashiest heal card in the deck. A 6 mana spell that sets your maximum health total to 40, as well as heals you for 20, which is, pretty easy to wrap your head around for a control deck. Having more health means you're harder to beat. It's pretty good. As far as other heal cards are concerned, we have 2 copies of Compost Charm. Both of them are 2 mana spells. They both heal you for 10, and if your Void has 8 or more cards in it, you get a random nature card in your hand. Besides healing, Control Nature is also known for having lots of value, usually through randomly generated cards. Compost Charm is a great example of that. It both heals you and generates you a random card, an excellent control tool. Then, as far as healing is concerned, we have 2 copies of Demo, which can heal you for, who knows how much, usually at least 3, but it could be infinite. And then, of course, you have your Selena's Mark God Power, which deals 1 damage and heals you for 1 every time you use it. And don't be confused by the Animal Bond God Power here. This player has only picked Animal Bond 1 time, and that was when he was playing against Combo Magic. And if you happen to be running up against Combo Magic, you should probably also pick Animal Bond, but every other matchup, you're going to want the Selena's Mark. Control Nature is also known for having very strong early game removal tools. We have 2 copies of Canopy Barrage, which is excellent removal, especially good against like aggro deception. Control Nature as a whole is just built to beat aggro deception. If you run into, you can be a horrible like Control Nature player and go up against a great aggro deception player, and it's still like an 80-20 matchup because none of their removal spells care about hidden. It's very effective. So we've got the Canopy Barrage, we have the Fey Flame Blades, which are also great for controlling the early board state, great for destroying like Vexing Vicars, great for just popping protected bubbles, a very effective relic in the early game. Then we have Underbrush Boar, which really doesn't need any explanation. It's just an extremely high tempo card. It's a creature that destroys a creature. Really, really great. 2 copies of Lightning Strike, which is great for destroying Pyramid Wardens, Demos, Guild Enforcers, any like mid to late game threat. It's very powerful. And then we have the Super Lightning Strike in your single copy of Frenzied Ritual, which deals 12 damage to a random enemy creature and deals damage to a friendly creature and generates you a random card. Since you are playing Control Nature, you're going to be in situations where you either don't have any creatures on the board or you have like a little unimportant creature, right? Like a Jason, and there's no reason to not destroy your own creature in order to get rid of your opponent's large creature. And just like the Compost Charm, you are generating a random nature card for your hand. We've got the Nefarious Briar to deal with all of War, Light, and Death's Relics, very effective in the meta currently. As we're moving to the mid-game, we have Falling Star as well as Fir Tree's Fury for your control tools. Falling Star is a very slow removal spell. It gives a creature burn +6 and then makes you a bunch of badgers that you can use to trade or threaten your opponent, whatever is called for at the time. Burning a creature +6 is also very powerful against Martyr of White Plains. They play their martyr dies, they play their big thing, and then you burn it for 6, and now their creature's not very good anymore. So that's very powerful. You also have your Fir Tree's Fury, some small AoE removal, but it's very, very flexible removal. If your opponent has 1 mid-sized creature, it can get rid of it. If your opponent has a bunch of small creatures, it can also get rid of it. But there is one other synergy I want to talk about with the Fir Tree's Fury and the Falling Star, and that is, of course, Hevnir. And when I first saw this deck, I did not like the Hevnir at all. I looked through the list and I went, this is a Control Nature list. There aren't that many wild creatures. Hevnir can't possibly be that big. But you do have 2 copies of Falling Stars, which generates you 6 badgers altogether, and the Fir Tree Fury, which could generate you as many as 5, 1-mana wild creatures. Usually you want the Fir Tree's Fury to destroy your opponent's creatures, but sometimes you do end up with, a few of those little frosty fruits of your own, and this does put you in a position where if you do just play this for tempo and get 5 frosty fruits, it will buff up your Hevnir and make it better in the late game. So in those situations where Fir Tree's Fury isn't that good, the Hevnir makes up for it. Then we move to the 6 mana slots and we get to the AoE portions. Oh, you know what? I didn't mention Veil Warden Minotaur when we were talking about healing. Veil Warden Minotaur does heal you for 3 and it generates you a random card. The card it generates you is a 7 mana wild creature, which is always pretty strong. Even the worst ones are still pretty high value. And since you're a control deck with not the biggest top end, being able to generate more 7 mana creatures is very, very powerful. But then we get to the AoE removal, and Nature has a lot of good things going for it. They have great healing cards, they have great early game removal cards, but they do not have good AoE. This deck runs 2 copies of Enchanted Vines and 2 copies of the Hunt. Both of them are adequate AoE removal cards. Enchanted Vines deals 4 damage to 4 random creatures, including your own, so if you have a board, it could potentially hurt you. But if you don't have a board, you're dealing 4 damage to your opponent's stuff, which, 4 damage is a pretty good amount. You're not killing Demos or Guild Enforcers or Pyramid Wardens, but you're getting rid of smaller things, and you're getting rid of a lot of it at one time, which is strong, and of course you are generating that random nature card for your hand. Your other AoE removal card is the Hunt, which is a 6 mana, deal 8 damage, randomly split amongst enemy creatures. So, it could be a good board clear. It's very strong against something like Hidden Rush Deception, but against something like Zoo Light, which makes like big, high health creatures, it's going to be very ineffective. These cards do sort of work well together. You can use Enchanted Vines to soften up your opponent's board and then use the Hunt to finish them. That being said, you'll be spending 2 6-mana turns to destroy one board. That's not great value right there. But besides the AoE, Nature has very strong cards. It's just they are severely lacking in good AoE removal. But then we transition over to the late game. We are a control deck, so we have 2 copies of Demo as well as 1 copy of Ethereal for the value. This deck has no Martyrs of White Plains, which is quite rare for control decks. But in lieu of the Martyrs, we have Jason for even more value and for making your deck bigger for those potential fatigue matchups. And as you can see, 3 question mark series, played 22 games, with an 81% win rate. So this deck is definitely pretty strong. Control Nature has been doing very well in the meta. In fact, I think it's a pretty good sleeper pick. It's good against most of the control decks. It can struggle against Light and War, especially if War has like a lot of protected stuff, and if Light has like a protected Benediction, then Light will probably win. But it's definitely well equipped to beat Hidden Rush Deception. It's adequate against the other aggro decks. And because of its extremely high health total and all those randomly generated cards, it's also pretty good in the control versus control matchups. So yeah, Control Nature, definitely a pretty powerful deck. But now let's take a look at the next Nature list. And this is like a mid-range Nature list. It's definitely far less control-oriented than the last one we looked at. As you can see from the curve, it's way, way lower. We have Marshwalkers, we have Gleam Weavers, we have Vanguard Axemen, plenty of 1-mana creatures. We have a lot of the same early game removal tools. We have the Canopies, we have the Fey Flames, we have the Underbrush Boars, we have the Lightning Strikes. But this deck is capable of applying far more pressure than the previous Nature deck we just looked at. As you can see, we have 2 copies of Moonlight Charm in here, which is like a worse version of Lysander's Spear. But Lysander's Spear is so good that if you can run a bad version, you probably do. So this card gives your strongest creature +2/+2 every turn, until it's out of durability, which turns your tiny creatures into big threatening creatures. This deck also has omitted the Enchanted Vines and the Hunt, and replaced it with a Sudden Bloom. And since we have Sudden Bloom and this is Nature, we also have 2 copies of Feral Shapeshifter, a very powerful combination. The Feral Shapeshifter is hard to interact with, like I say in all of these videos. Hidden creatures are hard to remove, so it probably lives, and then you get to Sudden Bloom it, making it an 8/8 with Overkill and Twin Strike, which should be able to either pressure your opponent immensely or clear their entire board while dealing some damage. This deck has significantly less healing. As you can see, there's no Compost Charms, there's no Veil Warden Minotaurs, there's no Demos, but we do still have the single copy of Winter's Bounty, which will heal you for 20 and set your maximum health total to 40. Seeing as you have so much fewer healing in this deck, you probably won't be at 40 health that often, but this will help you sustain longer, and you do, of course, have your Selena's Mark God power to help heal you a little bit, plus you have Therial, which might generate you some Cultists that heal you for 7. So you should be able to make use out of that high health total. But the most important aspect of this deck is, as you can see, this player has played 108 games with 72% win rate, very respectable, and 262 players have played with a 66% win rate, which is very, very good. Usually the world at large has a significantly lower win rate than the creator, but this deck has been performing very well over many, many games, and it's significantly faster than the last Control Nature deck we looked at. This deck is very similar to the third Control Light list we looked at, the one made by Fake Muse, where it's sort of like a hybridization between Aggro Nature and Control Nature. This one is far more aggro-oriented than the last Nature deck we looked at. But like I said, almost no healing, much, much fewer removal. And just, the late game, we only have 1 7-mana creature and no Veil Wardens. So this deck is still capable of producing a lot of value. Of course, we have the 2 Martyrs of White Plains, which you could use in combination with Therial to get 3 Therials, and 3 Therials is a lot of value. And, like I just said, this deck has a very respectable win rate over many, many games. So if you're a fan of Nature and you want to try something a little bit different with this, mid-rangey Control Nature, I think it could be very good this weekend ranked event. Alright, and our final archetype to discuss is Aggro Deception. I've got 2 different Aggro Deception lists. We have this one as well as a budget version to go over next. So Aggro Deception is in a really interesting spot in the meta right now. If you remember from last episode, I didn't like Deception at all, especially Aggro Deception. And that was because Control Nature was very, very popular 2 weeks ago. But like I said in the beginning of this video, Control Nature has been dropping in popularity as the week has been going by. And Control Nature is hard beats Aggro Deception. But if Control Nature is becoming less popular, then Aggro Deception fares very well against the majority of the other popular decks in the meta. As far as the control decks are concerned, Control Light has a very hard time dealing with all of these hidden creatures. They rely extremely heavily on Lips Are Sealed, so if your Control Light opponent rather doesn't draw their Lips Are Sealed, they'll have almost no way of stopping your assault. All of your very strong hidden creatures, you have your Shadow Lethanons, you have your Armor Lurkers, you have your Shade Walkers, your Avatar of Deception, your Arms Dealers, your Merrics. All of these creatures can't be targeted to be ordered, which means they can't be slowed down by light. You're capable of buffing all of these creatures with your Dark Knives, with your Assassin's Aims. You use your Orpheus Distraction God Power to keep them hidden. It's a very simple strategy. You play your creatures, you make them hard to interact with, and you go face over and over and over again. And then when you're talking about like the aggressive decks in the meta, Zoo Light has always been notoriously weak against Aggro Deception. They have a very hard time interacting with hidden creatures, and Zoo Light likes to be the player that initiates the trade so they can take as many value trades as possible. And since all of your creatures are hidden, when trading happens, you'll be the player initiating the trades, which means you can guarantee that they're bad trades for your opponent and good trades for you. So it's very strong in the Zoo Light matchup. Against Aggro War, it's going to be mostly a toss-up. Both decks are extremely aggressive. You as the Aggro Deception player, you're capable of being aggressive faster, right? Like you have all these strong 1 and 2 mana cards. You can immediately start buffing them with your Dark Knives or with your Assassin's Aim and just get out of hand quickly. You can play your Pyramid Warden on turn 1. You can Assassin's Aim on turn 2, and then you're dealing 5 damage every single turn until your opponent is defeated. You can even go further, play that Assassin's Aim on Pyramid Warden on turn 2. The turn after, you can Dark Knives it and Orpheus Distract it, and now all of a sudden you're dealing 8 damage a turn with just that one creature, and it can get out of hand very quickly. Obviously, you don't need to use Pyramid Warden in order to buff it with Assassin's Aim. You have plenty of other potential buff candidates. You have your Lady Marcella, you have your Ludia's Dedicant, which is not only like a strong creature on its own, its effect, which benefits you for using your Orpheus Distraction God Power, which you're using the majority of the time anyway, is very strong. You can get good cards from your opponent's deck. The Blessed mechanic is also very strong for aggro decks. It pretty much guarantees that you'll be the player that gets to pick from the Sanctum first and get that best card, so you can be the one who gets the Vow of Champions and deny your opponent that very flexible Sanctum card. You have your Merrick in here to double capitalize on all of your buff effects. You have Surprise Delivery, which is also very strong in the aggro matchups. When you're playing against Control, it's decent. It deals 6 damage eventually. But when you're playing against like Zoo Light, for example, filling up 3 of their slots with like these worthless barrels is very powerful. It makes their AoE buffs weaker. It makes Chaining of the Gods, much weaker. It's generally a very strong card in those aggro matchups for this style of deck. But generally speaking, as you can see from the curve, you're playing your creatures aggressively, you're keeping them hidden, you're buffing them, and you're going face very successfully. But as you can see, this deck is relatively expensive for an aggro deck, $335 USD. But this deck is very easy to make budget friendly. You can easily replace these Shade Walkers with other powerful cards. These 2 Shade Walkers are about $24 for each. Avatar of Deception can easily be replaced by Loki and Disciple. Avatar of Deception is like $75. And then, of course, you have the Pyramid Wardens, which are about $95 each. So just, those few cards represent the vast majority of this deck's price. So let's jump into the budget variation of that deck. I simply took this past deck list. I removed the more expensive cards and put in, budget-friendly options. So there's that aforementioned Loki and Disciple. I removed the Shade Walkers. I put in 1 Lethal Prowler. Lethal Prowler is very strong in aggro deception. Your creatures are hidden, which means you're almost always going to be able to go face. So the Lethal Prowler is just 5 damage, 5 burst damage your opponent's not expecting. It's very, very powerful with Shadow of Lethanon or just, any hidden creature. Obviously, there were 2 Shade Walkers in the deck before. There's only 1 Lethal Prowler. The other card I threw in was Madame Denholm. Madame Denholm obviously synergizes well with Lethal Prowler. It generates you little 1/1 Skulkers that you can use to proc the attack. It itself is also hidden, which means it can proc the attack. It has 2 health. which means it's a candidate for Assassin's Aim. It's not the greatest Assassin's Aim target, obviously, but it can be Assassin's Aim for more of that damage. In the Pyramid Warden slot, Pyramid Warden is fairly unique. There's not a great like pound for pound trade. I threw an Encumbered Looter. It's another hidden creature. It cycles itself, so you can get to more of your strong stuff. Obviously, you can't Orpheos Distract this creature. You obviously can't Assassin's Aim it, which is unfortunate. So like, if you want another early game creature that is specifically there for buffs, something like a Skeletal Hoplite here, could work well. Skeletal Hoplite, its armor makes it so you can Orpheos Distracted over and over again. Its 2 health means that it can be Assassin Aimed. Obviously, any creature can be Dark Knives. So like, if you want like that, like to replace Pyramid Warden with another potential buff creature, then Skeletal Hoplite could be good. But Skeletal Hoplite's also very slow. Like realistically, you're playing it on turn 3 and you'll be God powering it like the turn you play it, and that's a very slow play. And for an aggressive deck like this, you want to be much, much faster. But as you can see, with those small modifications, the deck went from $335 to a very reasonable $50. Far more attainable, and this deck should perform very well. It's should function very similarly to the baseline deck we discussed, which has played 44 games with a 75% win rate, and the World at Large has played 60 games with a 73% win rate. So this deck is definitely strong. That being said, it's very meta dependent. If you see there's a lot of nature on the ladder, then definitely do not play Aggro Deception. However, if you see that nature remains to be unpopular, then Aggro Deception can be very, very strong. Like I said, it's pretty good against the other aggro decks in the meta. It can potentially outrace Aggro War, but like I said, it's going to be mostly a coin flip. It's going to be based off who goes first and who has the better opening hand. But then against something like Zoolite, this deck is very favored. You get to make all the good value trades. You get to go face much, much faster than they get to go face. And yeah, Aggro Deception is a fairly strong archetype. The budget-friendly version is by far the cheapest deck we discussed in this video. There's no conclusion for this format because all the decks we discussed are cream of the crop. That being said, Order Light has been the strongest archetype in the game for the past couple of weeks, but whatever you go with, try to have fun, tell us how you did in the TST Discord, and have a wonderful day.
Hey you! Did you know that subscribing to the TST YouTube channel will increase your win rate by 6.9%? So what are you waiting for? Subscribe to the channel and hit the bell for notifications. And while you're at it, equip Scythe of the Harvest and attack the like button directly in the face. Bye-bye!